Let's talk variation. Specifically, let's talk about variation in the player experience as they play your game. Obviously, your game is not the same thing over and over and over. It changes as you move through it. That's kind of what makes it worth playing. But this kind of change is not necessarily something that comes naturally to every game designer. And even if a game designer does know how to make interesting variation, they might just forget. They might be focused on creating cool combat sequences or intricate rules and forget to make the game interesting. Whoops. Well, you don't want to forget to make the game interesting. That's kind of important, and I thought we could talk about it a little bit. Obviously, this is all going to be from my personal perspective, my take on these matters. I am not some arbiter of truth, but it should at least be fun to talk about. And my opinion here is that variation in player experience is the thing that makes the players want to play. It's how the players grip your game and feel like they are making progress. So you need it. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're watching a YouTube video and somebody says that rather than a mission where you have 6 talk to line items, talk to A, B, C, D, E, F, you should instead break it into 3 missions where you have 2 talk to objectives in each mission. Technically, this is probably better. It gives you a lot more control and a lot more focus, but it's still really boring. It's terrible because there's no variation, right? It would be better if there was a talk to 2 people mission, and then a spy on 3 people mission, and then a protect 1 person from assassins mission. You can immediately tell that this is a much more compelling group of missions. Because it varies, is that why? I don't think so. You see, there are a lot of games that create random missions, and those random missions vary, but they're universally the most boring missions in the game. It's not simply that these missions vary, it's that their variation is for a specific purpose. They vary in a way that allows the player to feel like the player is making progress. The player talks to 2 people, and then they are done talking to 2 people. They put talking to 2 people behind them, and they have earned the right to move into a different set of objectives, different actions to take, different risks, a different role in the story, a different amount of momentum and inertia, and then onward into a 3rd mission after that. Each one of these missions gets put behind the player as it's completed, and they have earned the right to move into another mission with the might of that mission that they completed before guiding them. It's a progression of missions. But the important part here is that the player realizes it in their head. The player considers it a progression. If the player is here doing talk to 2, talk to 2, talk to 2, they're going to think that this is the same kind of mission over and over and over, even if, in actuality, it's escalating rapidly. Now you're talking to the king, now you're talking to a god. Sure, but it's still just a talk to 2 people mission, according to the player's head. And this is all about what the player is perceiving. It's the player's experience that we're talking about. So we need to talk about what that means. Because what that means is that this is not a mechanical setup. This is entirely about how the player perceives these missions. It's not about what you put in their journal or about what mechanic they use while on the missions. It's about what they think of the mission. Let me show you what I mean. This is a talk to 2 people mission, and this is a spy on 3 people mission. Maybe the spy on 3 people mission is a different mechanic, stealth, for example. But it could also just be talk to those 3 people as a spy and try and ferret out what they're doing. It could just be another talk to mission mechanically. But because we're very careful to portray it as a mission with a specific kind of objective, rather than just talking to people, the fact that it's mechanically the same as the previous mission doesn't come up. It's not important, because in the player's mind, this mission has a different role in the story. It is a different mission, even if the mechanisms are the same. Let me give you a more specific example. you're making one of these games where the player gets stranded on a tropical island and has to gather up coconuts and leaves and berries and stuff and make a little Robinson Crusoe house. This is a pretty popular kind of game. There are thousands of these. So let me ask you, how do you lay out the resources on the map so the player can collect them? Nearly all of these games, especially the indie ones, will lay them out in the same way: random scatter. This is pretty much the worst possible way to lay out resources because it leaves no impression on the player's mind. The player can't look at this and form an opinion on it. They either see one giant long task of collect everything or 100 identical tasks of collect that one thing. It's a waste of opportunity. We really want to make the variation meaningful. Even if these assets are randomized, these are still going to be meaningless variations. How do we make them meaningful? Well, we create the variation to leave specific impacts on the player's minds. That doesn't require us to have new assets or pop-up objectives or anything like that. It just requires us to design the levels in such a way that they leave the impression we want to leave, which is a big part of level design. For example, we could put, berry bush, tree, berry bush, tree, berry bush. Now, when the player looks at this, they're going to immediately think of this as a flow of resources, a single sweep of resources. So even though in terms of their actual mechanical pattern of behavior, they're still moving and collecting and moving and collecting, it's very different from the previous example because in their mind, this is a single task, a single sweep that they're making. So they think of it as a sweep task or a sweep mission rather than a collecting mission. At least in theory. And we can continue that. We'll put up some plants here, trees, and then we'll put some berry bushes over here with maybe a tree. And now the player will notice when they come into this room that there are 3 different zones where they can collect things. And by choosing how they're going to hit those zones and if they're going to hit those zones, they will naturally form a progression in their mind, and each one of these tasks will have a different role in the overall progression of the screen. We're going here to establish a foothold, then we're sweeping here, then we're cleaning up with this. Even though all 3 of these are just, go there and collect things missions, because they have a different role in the player's mind, they are considered to be different tasks with, progression to them. And we can push this further. We can say, well, here is a rare, resource, and it's in like this nasty switchback. So there's a lot of walking involved to get to it. And then the player will understand that that is going to be like a hike mission. And because each of these tasks will impact the player's mind differently, they'll consider them differently, the player won't feel a repetitiveness nearly as quickly. Now, this is very ephemeral. These tasks are not really very different. We're trying to create a lot of tricks to try and make the player feel like the tasks are different by giving them different roles within the overall collection task, But it would be better if we could actually create some variation. That way we could really, really control the impact on the player's mind. For example, let's say that we have some berry bushes and a tree or 2 up here. And then there is a hog, a wild pig, walking around in this area, ready to gore you if you go over there. That really changes the role of this mission. Although the mission is still to collect berries and stuff, there is now a danger involved, and it becomes a mission where you have to take that into account. Do you have to wait for the boar to leave? Do you have to kite the boar away from the objective place? Do you have to stealth your way in? Whatever approach you decide to take, it changes what you think of the mission, even though at the end of the day, it is still just a berry collecting mission. And down here we could have something similar where we have these trees and these berry bushes, and there is a big old beehive. And as you go over here, if you spend very much time, the bees start to come out and get agitated, and they will sting you if you hang around. So again, it's just a collection mission, but because there is a risk, some kind of constraint, this will change how we perceive that mission. Now, obviously, we don't want to repeat ourselves a lot, at least not on the same screen. We want to have different kinds of patterns, different kinds of objectives. So we need to take all of this into account when we're building our levels, and it's why building levels is so compelling, both to the player and to the game dev. This is especially true in this kind of game where you're going to be revisiting the same screens as you power up. This screen might never change. Maybe it just respawns all of its various resources after a week or something. But the player will change. And maybe the player builds a cool axe or hunting bow, and they come into this place and, oh, they remember this place over here with the berries and the pig, but they're no longer interested in the berries. They've got plenty of berries. They do want that pig, though. Pig looks tasty. The same layout has changed to mean something else because the player's perspective has changed. Similarly, if they decide they want honey, and they figured out a way to get honey without pissing off the bees, or without getting stung at least, then that means that that area is now a place to get honey, rather than a place to avoid bees. It's critical to understand how your players are going to interpret whatever you're showing them, and that's going to really depend on the kind of game and how it's played. But if you stop to think about it and you try and create this sort of pattern where there are different considerations and a progression inherent to the system, you can really get some pretty good results even if you're not super confident about your design. It's generally much easier to polish something where you're trying rather than to realize that you haven't done anything at all and try and fill it in at the last second. There are a lot of other situations like this. For example, in an RPG, we generally think of RPGs as number go up sims, right? That's the reason why everybody plays RPGs. They like the numbers to go up. But that's not true. Numbers going up is just what numbers do. But those are like the berries and the coconuts in our previous example. They're just the thing that tell you what you should be doing, why that thing matters. They're your reward. But they're not the reason, they're not the task itself. They're not the nature of the mission. They're just a reward to get you to pay attention. When you go out into the wilderness and you fight monsters because they're going to give you numbers. But the fight is what you're doing. And when you go to a shop and you exchange numbers for numbers, you go to a shop because that's how you exchange the numbers. You want to exchange the numbers, but shopping is its own task. And most of what an RPG is exchanging numbers for numbers. You exchange hit points for money, and then you exchange money for better gear, so you can exchange less hit points for more money. Obviously, this is a lot more complicated. I don't want to go into it in a huge amount of detail. For example, the narrative is not a numbers-based system, but the point here is that an RPG often contains a lot of very distinctive tasks. When you're wandering around in an RPG overworld, for example, it's pretty rare that a player just wants to hang around in one place and fight monsters. Usually they want to move through the overworld. There are monsters to fight, sure, but there are also places to go, things to gather, places where you can heal yourself, places where you can find treasure, people you can talk to, an overlook that you can jump off of. There are a lot of things to do on the world map because the game wants to make sure that you never feel like you're doing something too repetitive. This is sort of a brute force approach, rather than our coconuts approach where it's always the same mission, but it just works a little differently. This is a set of very different tasks, and you're supposed to switch between the tasks. The design of the level is built specifically to encourage you to switch between tasks and feel like you're progressing. if we go into a town, for example, we're going to see something kind of similar, but more in line with what we were doing with our coconuts, right? When you're in a town, talking to people is the thing you do. And it can feel repetitive, but if the town is well designed, it won't feel that repetitive because everything you do will feel like it has a purpose. Like, you talk to this child to figure out what's going on in the town, and then you talk to the mayor, then you talk to the mayor's husband, then you go back to talk to the mayor, then you try and fix the bridge, but there's a bridge keeper that you've got to talk to, and then you talk to this other person over here to do this other thing. There's a sense of progression because you're always working at something, you're talking to people for different reasons, the talking has a different set of priorities. So in a well-designed town, even though everything is either talk to people or click something, you're still going to feel like there's a lot of variation in the quests because they're built specifically to feel like you're making progress. This structural progression is absolutely critical, and it's something that we often find is missing from arbitrary variation. For example, if you're making a game where you can hire anybody in London to shoot at folks with you, then someone might spend $50 million on creating sets of Londoner assets that can be randomized to give you 10,000 different Londoners. But those are not structured to give you a distinctive forward progression. They're not intended to make you feel like you're moving forward. So those are largely wasted variants. Maybe their role is something else. Maybe they're not wasted because they do something else. But they're wasted on this particular kind of experience. They're useless as this kind of variation. And that's the point. Not every kind of variation is going to help drive the player's experience forward. It's not going to help the player feel like they're moving forward if they're just met with random crap. Now, this isn't universal, because every player is different, and this is all going on inside the player's head. For some players, there will be a very powerful sense of progression as they move through these randomized characters. You can see that in something like No Man's Sky, where they generate literally billions of randomized planets, and most players don't find the differences compelling, because to most players, there's not really a good sense that they're making progress. It mostly feels like mud or oatmeal. But there are people who really engage with these planets, and they feel like each of these planets is distinct and interesting and worth visiting, at least the ones they choose to visit. That's fine. You have to understand which kinds of players you're going to be making your game for and whether or not your kind of variation is going to work for them. In my opinion, No Man's Sky wasted a lot of money on a kind of variation that very few people will appreciate. I just feel that the structure could have been designed better so that that variation would create a sense of personal progression as the player moved through it. But that's something that's up to each game developer to decide on their own. Is the structure good enough to provide a sense of forward progression? Even if that's not your focus, even if your focus is on creating beautiful art or, compelling mechanics, you still need the player to feel like they can play forward through your game. That should always be a priority. And this is how you do it, I say. I say it's by creating variation in play. Variation such that the player feels like they have accomplished something and are now moving forward. Let me know your opinion down below.